A couple weeks ago, I asked you guys to share your biggest tool regrets, and by far one of the most popular answers was the benchtop jointer. And there seemed to be two main reasons for this. One was they didn't have a real need for it, and the second was it didn't really perform the task well enough to even use. Don't get me wrong, a jointer is a great tool, and I love having one, but that doesn't mean it's necessary for every shop. Especially if you have a small space or limited budget, it may not make sense for you. You see, most amateur or hobbyist woodworkers aren't milling lumber every day. And if you are, a benchtop jointer probably isn't the right answer. But what if you don't have the room or the budget for a larger jointer? What do you do then? In this video, I'm going to show you my favorite way to mill lumber without a jointer. All you need is a flat board and some other common tools. Let's get right into it. The first thing I want to talk about is what a jointer actually does. And it basically has two primary purposes. The first is to create one flat face along the board, like this. The second is to create one flat edge that's 90 degrees to that face that we just flattened. And when it's broken down like that, it seems pretty simple. In order to replace a jointer, all you need to do is be able to create one flat face and then create a flat edge that's 90 degrees to that face. Pretty simple. Let me show you how. So here's the board that I'm going to be milling up today, and it's just a 4/4 piece of rough sawn walnut that I got from the mill. And the first thing to do is flatten one face. And I'm going to do this by using my thickness planer and this flat board, which is also called a planer sled. If a board is bowed or twisted and has some rock in it or some spring kind of in the middle, as it goes through the planer, that twist is going to stay in the board. It might take a nice layer off the board, but it's going to twist as it goes through, and underneath those rollers it applies a lot of pressure, which can just push on that twist, which will return as soon as it's out of the planer, or it pushes down in the center, pushing the bow down and taking a layer off, but the bow is going to come right back up as soon as it comes out of the planer. So we want to try and stabilize it on a nice flat board so that it can't twist or bow when it's going through the planer, and then you'll get a nice flat surface that doesn't spring back or twist when it's done. So in order to stabilize the piece of wood as it goes through the planer, it's going to need to ride on something called a planer sled. And it can be anything from plywood to MDF. This is just particle board that was left over, and that's going to go with the piece through the planer, and we're going to stabilize it on here so that it can't rock back and forth, it can't flex in the middle, so that it takes off a nice even layer and it stays consistently flat as it goes through. And on all my planer sleds, I like to put a block of wood at the back so that the piece can butt up against it. It's going to go through the planer in this direction, and the knives will be cutting against it this way. So this block of wood just helps make sure that this isn't going to break free and slide backwards as it's going through. So just a little safety precaution. You don't have to do it, but make sure that it's stuck down really well if you don't have something like this. And don't worry about these grooves that you see right here. These are actually for the next step in this process, and it's optional whether or not you want to do that. So when it comes to stabilizing the board on the planer sled, my favorite thing to use are composite shims or plastic shims and hot glue. And all you're going to do is place the piece of wood on the planer sled and then go around and see where it might rock or where it might flex and start putting shims underneath those spots. And you're just trying to make sure that it doesn't move, and you don't need to push them in with a lot of force. You're really just trying to keep it exactly how it is because the wood has dried and it's in the position it wants to be in, and we just want to support that as it goes through the planer. And once the board is fully supported where there's no more rock, it's not flexing anymore, then you can go with the hot glue, and you really just want to put a bead along any of the shims, or anywhere that you couldn't fit a shim maybe, you can just put a bead, and that's really going to hold this in place as it goes through the planer. This board is now ready to go through the planer. It's stabilized, it can't move. So now we're gonna send it through. It'll probably take a couple passes to get this side perfectly flat. And after that, we'll flip it over and run it back through. That took about 4 or 5 passes, and all we have to do now is pop this board off, and then this side will be perfectly flat, so then we can put this side down and send it back through the planer. So at this point, we have 2 really nice flat surfaces on each side. There's no more bow in the board. It's probably hard to tell on camera because this edge has quite a curve to it, so it might not make it look the straightest, but this thing is very true, very straight. And now all we have to do is cut 1 straight edge using the same jig that we just used. We can now use that to put a straight edge on this board. Let me show you how. So the planer sled that I just used to get each side flat, I can now use as a straight line rip jig. And that's what these grooves are for here. I can put these clamps into these grooves to hold this board in place while it goes through the table saw, which is going to reference the straight edge of this jig and then transfer it to this outside edge of our board here, giving us a nice straight edge. So all I have to do now is set the table saw to the exact width of this jig, or a little bit bigger so that I don't hit it, and then have a little bit, whatever I want taken off of this board, I can then just overhang it, set the blade to the right height, and then it'll put a perfectly straight edge on our board here. Well, I forgot to hit record on that cut, but here you can see kind of the outcome of using a straight line rip jig like this that gives you a nice, clean, straight edge. And now all I have to do is pop this board out of this jig, and then I can flip it over and use the nice straight edge to rip it to its final width. And just like that, we go from a rough milled board that looks like this, it's bent, warped, not straight in any way, to a perfectly flat, perfectly straight board that is now ready to use, all without a joiner. And obviously this requires some other tools like a planer and a table saw, but I see that it's much more common for people to own a planer and a table saw versus something like a jointer. So I just wanted to share this method. It's super simple. It only requires a board that you probably have laying around, and if you want to go with something like the match fit system, you can do that. You could do T-track, or you could even just use double-sided tape to hold it down. And as always, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope that you learned something, and if you did, please do not hesitate to hit that like button. Thanks for watching.